So Hebrews chapter 11, we're just walking through Hebrews chapter 11. We began this soon after we started our series on the power of faith in January through February. And I just feel that we should continue it. And today I had expected to go on to Moses, who would be the last main character that we would look at, and then one final session where the author throws in a lot of other names and sort of concludes this section of Hebrews. But before we get to Moses, tonight we come to the faith of Moses's parents. And I've read Hebrews 11 many times, and I will have read by this passage, but it never grabbed me until I was looking at the scripture to speak tonight, that Moses's parents are in Hebrews chapter 11. Maybe you knew that. Maybe you think, well, of course they are. But, you know, it surprised me. Moses's parents are in Faith's Hall of Fame. And so I thought we'd just briefly have a look at that tonight. The Hebrews author is trying to show Jewish Christians that are under exceeding pressure and persecution, not that they should not go back to the Mosaic law and the Old Testament to follow the law without Christ, but they should remain in the new covenant following Jesus, and that the new covenant is all about walking by faith. And so he's going back to the Old Testament to show that nothing's changed, that all these great people in the Old Testament also walked and lived by faith. This isn't a new thing. And so here, before we get, and next week we will be looking at Moses himself, but here in this one verse, it says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. I've read that many times, but it says by faith Moses, and so you think, oh yeah, this is Moses. But actually, by faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for a period of 3 months. And that's because they saw the child was beautiful. There's a little bit more to that, as we'll see, that they saw that he was beautiful, and there was something very spiritual about this child that God had a plan for, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. They weren't afraid of laws, even laws, not just culture pressure, but even laws against them. They were not afraid. Faith deals with fear. So we'll come back to that passage in Hebrews 11, but let's go to source in Exodus chapter 2. Now, in Exodus chapter 1, it begins by telling us how wealthy and blessed the Jewish people were. The Hebrews were in Egypt. I mean, they had everything. They were, you just see it there in Exodus 1. Everything was absolutely fantastic. I mean, if the things that were to happen didn't happen, I don't think that the Hebrews would ever have left Egypt. Why would they leave Egypt when they were so at home, so blessed, so prosperous? It's all there in Exodus 1. But then that famous phrase that a pharaoh came that knew not, a pharaoh arose that knew not Joseph. So before, the pharaohs and the Egyptian people were extremely grateful to Joseph and thus his family for saving them from famine. And in fact, the known world around there was also saved from famine, and Egypt were made rich in selling all the grain. And they were so grateful, and the Pharaoh was grateful, and Joseph was second in command. And that lasted for quite a while. But then one Pharaoh comes up and says, I don't care who Joseph was. What do I care about that? I'm Pharaoh. I don't owe these people anyway. Why are they so prosperous in our own land? And then it began to get bad for them, to the point where they no longer wanted God's people to multiply. And so the idea was that the girls could stay, but the boys, they needed to be eradicated. I think you know the story. And so they're trying to kill the male seed of the Hebrews. And we've been speaking a lot about the male seed, haven't we, of the Hebrews? We've been speaking about the spiritual seed that went from Abraham, not through Ishmael, but through Isaac, not through Esau, but through Jacob. And Jacob blessed the younger son of Joseph. So we've been talking about this, and now we got the story of a Hebrew child amongst many Hebrew children, boys, not girls, boys, so it's seed again, that the Egyptians were trying to eradicate, that there would be no more Hebrew boys eventually, no more Hebrew men bringing forth the physical line. So it's quite powerful what's going on. Then here in front of you, Hebrews 2, and a man of the house of Levi went and took as a wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So he called his name Moses, because I drew him out of the water. I mean, you could just preach on that whole story, couldn't you? But we're going to sort of like stick with the Hebrews authors' focus on it. And so by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months, no longer, no shorter, by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. It must have been very difficult to walk by faith in those 3 months. I mean, how do you hide a boy child? How do you hide a child? People were looking for these boys. They were looking for babies, boys. Every time somebody gave birth, they were in danger. They had to be vetted. They had to be looked at. And so, to keep a child secret, as it were, must have been very difficult from the authorities. And yet they kept him secret. They must have kept him indoors. They must have been concerned every time as a baby he cried. But there was something about Moses, not just that he was their children. It doesn't say just because he was their child. It says they saw the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. There was something about this child that was extra special, and they believed that. And they believed that the life of this child was more important than even the king. And the king, the Pharaoh, of course, had the power of life and death over everybody under him. So, this says quite an amazing thing. It shows that they were not fearful to do God's will, even though the government told them that they should not. Not that they made a big fuss about it, but they just carried on as normal, doing what they knew was right. They knew it was wrong, what the government had did, and they weren't afraid. They weren't afraid. But then that was for 3 months. It says for 3 months, both in the story in Exodus, it mentions the 3 months and that the child was a beautiful child. And in this one verse in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, it also mentions that he was hidden for 3 months because the child was beautiful. And so it was this timing is important. Let me just complete this, because there's another account of this story found in Acts chapter 7. I don't know if you know that. Now, in Acts chapter 7, we have this incredible speech by Stephen before he's martyred, and and before he's martyred, and he goes through interpreting the history of the Hebrews right up to Jesus. And here you see the section where he's talking about Moses. So Acts 7, verse 17 to 22. But when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, until another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. When it says expose their babies, this is what it means. It means to take them out, put them on a hill on a cold evening, and let them die of exposure. The Romans would do this a lot to babies that they didn't want. So that's what it means, so that they might not live. At this time, Moses was born and well pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. And so that phrase, well pleasing to God, when you look at the Greek that's used, it means that he's beautiful, he's wonderful, but not just to his parents, but to God. So here, Stephen is letting us know that there's something a little bit more to this act of faith by the parents than it was just their child that they loved as any parent would love. It says that he was pleasing to God, or he was beautiful to God. And so God had obviously communicated in some way to the parents that this was a spiritual, supernaturally chosen and favored child. So that's very helpful for that when we talks about them. So we see that these parents, by faith, they're seeing God's favor and following it. They're seeing God's plan and they're following it. And they realize that God's plan for this child is totally the opposite to the world's plan for this child, and the government's plan, if I can use that phrase, and the legal plan for this child. They're in a society, and the government is again. It makes me think a little bit, just a little bit, of the terrible Holocaust that took place under the Nazis and also the Russians. And it makes me think about all these people who died, but you hear stories of people that sheltered Jewish children, Jewish families, and put their own lives at risk, or help them get out and escape, and put their own lives at risk, even though government policy, Nazi policy, was that they shouldn't do that. Well, here are parents, making sure that their child that had a sentence of death over it was protected. But and also added to that, God had a special interest in this child. And so for 3 months, why 3 months? Well, perhaps after 3 months, it was getting to the place where they could no longer hide that child in their house. Maybe they're in a place where I don't think they lost faith after 3 months. I don't think that was it. But for 3 months they hid him, and then the next thing was, well, they can't hide him any longer. So what can they do? So actually, it was a great step of faith. They believed that God had his hand on this child, and so what they did was that they put the child in a basket and trusted God's favor, God's grace, and the fact that he was very pleasing to God. God had communicated something to that effect, as Stephen said in his speech. And so they put him in this reeds and they put him out into the water. What a difficult moment that must have been, to put your child in there and just to say, this is our child, but we also believe that God's hand is on this child. And so we're just going to trust that his hand is on this child, and no longer can we by faith do this in our house. We just got to turn this child totally and utterly over to God. And if God, who has communicated that this child is beautiful to him, pleasing to him, if he really means it, God will step in. But if he doesn't, well, then this child's going to die. So what an incredible thing to do. What an incredible thing to do. They weren't afraid, but then they had to take the next step. And you know the story. What an incredible story. What an incredible God. Just at that time, the princess comes down, the maidens get the child, and then at the end of it, the mother, can you imagine how the mother felt, and the father? Because it says his parents were involved in this, not just the mother. Can you imagine how they felt when they received that day their son back to them, fully protected under royal protection, and were given an income to look after him until he was old enough to go to court, to go to the royal court? It's just the most incredible thing in the world. Can you imagine how you would feel if you got your child back after all that? You've turned your child over to God. There's nothing more you can do. You believe that God's hand is on him, but there's nothing more you can do by faith. And so you turn it over to God. And God, in the most beautiful way, in the most supernatural way, yet also natural way, steps in, and you go home that day with the child and an income to look after that child. It just staggers me. But what staggers me more is how Moses' parents must have felt, how they must have felt about what God had done. Unbelievable, incredible. They lived by faith for 3 months, not afraid of the king, but careful, watching over, hiding for 3 months. And then after 3 months, their faith was rewarded, that God was in control, and this wonderful miracle took place. So I think that one verse in Hebrews 11:23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and also beautiful in God's sight, and they were not afraid of the king's edict, is just so powerful that I'm so glad that the author of Hebrews didn't skip it like I did last week. In my mind, I said, we're going to the last person now before we do the conclusion. We're going to the last person, and that's Moses. I skipped this story. But isn't it interesting that the author of Hebrews didn't skip this story? And Stephen, you read Acts chapter 7 and Stephen's speech, he goes through the whole history of Israel to Jesus, and yet he too still has time to say that they had a child, and that they hid him they had a child, and that they hid him for 3 months. He mentions is that Stephen, and that he was well pleasing to God. Isn't that amazing? There's something more to this than even I've said today, that Stephen in that speech would include that he was beautiful to God, that the faith was there for 3 months, and that God came through. So much for us to learn here and be encouraged in, to go God's way, even if it's against the government or society of our day, and to know that what God has blessed, no person can curse. And when God tells us to do something, or God says he's going to use us, then we have to walk by faith, because it might seem that everybody's against us, but if God is for us, who can be against us? And then we walk by faith. It might be longer than 3 months, it might be shorter, but then we see God come into circumstances in such an incredible supernatural but natural way. The princess, she didn't think anything particularly miraculous had taken place, and neither did her servants. But the parents knew, and it was such a powerful thing that they got included in the Faith's Hall of Fame. Great. Thank you, Pastor Doreen.